Hey everybody, and welcome back.
Sorry.
You've been wrestling with some pretty big questions about faith and government and what it means to actually live out your beliefs in a democracy.
Oh, yeah.
Well, today we're going to be diving into a sermon that tackles these very topics. It's called Ain't Over Yet, P8.
Okay.
And this one really struck a chord with me, especially given that it was delivered right after a U.S. election. You can practically feel the tension and the raw emotion in the room as the speaker is grappling with how we reconcile our faith with, all the realities of politics.
Yeah, it's interesting how the sermon starts by acknowledging that democracy,
Right.
while often idealized, isn't a system directly prescribed in the Bible.
Right. It's like we put democracy up on this pedestal, but we forget that it ultimately hinges on the choices of, us.
Right.
Imperfect humans.
Yeah.
And that can lead to outcomes that clash with our personal values or our sense of what's right, which is exactly what the speaker seems to be wrestling with.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this tension, the speaker uses a powerful analogy from the Old Testament. The story of Israel demanding a king from 1 Samuel 8.
Okay.
They saw other nations with kings, and they wanted to be like them, rejecting the way that God had been leading them.
Right.
Even though it wasn't God's ideal, he allowed them to have their way.
That's such a human thing to do, isn't it?
It is.
To want what everyone else has, even if it doesn't quite align with what we know deep down is best.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder how often we do the same thing today, chasing worldly systems, even when they feel misaligned with our faith.
Definitely a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
And it leads right into the speaker's big takeaway, that God uses flawed people,
Okay.
not just in the process of choosing leaders,
Right.
but in the leaders themselves.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. The speaker uses the example of King David.
Yes.
A man who committed adultery and even murder, yet is described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart.
It's an example that challenges our assumptions about who God should work through, isn't it?
Totally.
We tend to have this image of perfect, squeaky, clean leaders.
Yeah.
But the Bible paints a much more complex picture.
It's kind of reassuring, actually.
Right.
Even the man after God's own heart messed up big time.
Right.
But, as we always say, acknowledging this doesn't mean that we condone bad behavior.
Precisely. The point isn't to excuse wrongdoing,
Right.
but to recognize God's power to work despite human failings.
Uh-huh.
And if that's true for figures like King David, what might that mean for how we view our own flaws and imperfections?
Good point. It definitely shifts the perspective a bit, but then the sermon dives into what can be a really tricky area,
Sure.
Romans 13.
Yeah.
This is where Paul talks about submitting to governing authorities.
Right.
Because all authority ultimately comes from God, pay taxes, give respect, even when it's hard.
And to emphasize this point, the speaker highlights how this applied even to the Roman government, the very same one that ultimately executed both Paul and Jesus.
Wow, that puts things in perspective. This is where faith and politics really collide for a lot of people. How do we reconcile this command with leaders that we perceive as unjust or even ungodly?
It's a challenging question, and the sermon doesn't offer any easy answers. Instead, it points us towards a framework for action centered on prayer and good citizenship. Instead of getting caught up in that fight against flawed leaders, what if we shift our focus to praying for them?
Okay.
Seeking God's wisdom and guidance for them, regardless of their political stance or whether we agree with their decisions.
That's a powerful image, and it reminds me of something else. The speaker emphasized that idea that our ultimate citizenship is in heaven.
Yes, it's such a key point.
Right.
It doesn't mean we just check out of earthly politics,
Right.
but it definitely changes our perspective. It's like
Yeah.
the stakes are still high, but the game is totally different.
Yeah, it makes me think about how much energy we pour into political debates and anxieties.
Yeah.
What if we channeled even a fraction of that into prayer?
Right.
Could that make a real difference?
It's a question worth considering, and this is where the sermon makes a crucial distinction. Choosing a national leader is different from choosing a spiritual leader.
Okay.
We might look for different qualities. We might apply different standards.
It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful reminder, especially in the heat of an election cycle.
Absolutely. And it underscores that ultimately our personal relationship with God is our own responsibility. We can't blame our leaders for our own spiritual growth or lack thereof.
But that doesn't mean we just check out of being good citizens, right?
Not at all.
Okay.
The sermon circles back to Romans 13 here, urging us to be responsible citizens
Right.
who pay our taxes, respect the law, and don't use our faith as an excuse to break the rules.
You know, it's interesting because sometimes it feels like faith and politics are at odds.
Yeah.
But this message is saying that they can coexist.
Mm-hmm.
We can be deeply faithful and engaged citizens,
Yes.
even when we disagree with those in power.
And the example of Paul is so powerful here.
Right.
He knew when to submit to authority, but he also knew when to stand up for his rights, even using the legal system to protect himself from injustice.
It's like knowing the rules of the game allows you to play it strategically,
Exactly.
to advocate for what's right within the system, just like Paul did.
Exactly. And this ties back to you as a learner who's seeking knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
It's about being informed, being discerning, not just reacting emotionally,
Right.
but acting strategically.
Okay, so we've talked about submitting to authority, being good citizens, but the sermon also gets into the heart of leadership itself,
Right.
whether it's political or spiritual, and it emphasizes that leadership isn't about power or self-gain,
Right.
but about serving others.
And this is such an important point because it applies to all of us.
Right.
Whether we hold formal leadership positions or not,
Yeah.
we all have influence in our circles, family, friends, work, community.
Yeah.
And that influence carries responsibility.
It's like we're all leaders in some way, shaping the world around us through our words, our actions, our choices.
Mm-hmm.
But as the sermon points out, sometimes the biggest challenge isn't leading well,
Right.
but navigating the divisions that can arise,
Yeah,
especially around politics.
that's right. The speaker gets pretty real about how politics can create these deep fissures,
Right?
even within families and churches.
Yeah.
Like suddenly those who disagree with us politically become the enemy.
It's so easy to fall into that us versus them mentality,
It is.
to demonize the other side and forget that we're all human beings with shared hopes and struggles.
And this is where the sermon makes a really powerful point.
Mm-hmm.
Politics has a way of distorting who the real enemy is. We get so caught up fighting each other that we forget about the spiritual battle that's raging all around us.
So how do we combat that?
Right.
How do we resist those divisive forces and stay focused on what truly matters?
Well, the sermon points to Ephesians 6, where Paul talks about putting on the full armor of God.
Okay.
Our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of darkness.
That's such a powerful reminder, especially when the political rhetoric gets heated.
Yeah.
Sometimes the people we demonize are more like victims than enemies.
Mm.
They need God's grace just as much as we do.
And that's the heart of the message, isn't it? It's not about winning political arguments or proving ourselves right.
Right.
It's about reflecting God's love and grace to everyone,
Yeah.
regardless of their political beliefs.
That image that the speaker used, being healers, not dividers, really stuck with me.
Yeah.
It's like a call to action, an invitation to be peacemakers in a world that's so full of conflict.
And it requires a conscious choice
Yeah.
to step back from the political fray and ask ourselves, how can I be a bridge builder in this situation?
Right.
How can I demonstrate God's love and grace even to those I disagree with?
It's not about ignoring injustice or pretending that differences don't exist.
Right.
It's about choosing a different posture.
Yes.
A different way of engaging.
It's about recognizing that our political opponents are not our enemies.
Right.
They're our neighbors.
Yeah.
They're image bearers of God just like us.
Uh-huh.
And as followers of Christ, we're called to love them, to pray for them, and to seek their good, even when it's hard.
So you've heard a lot about what this sermon had to say.
Yes.
But now, as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay.
What does it actually look like to live out that heavenly citizenship in the midst of our very earthly, very divided realities?
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it, to hold on to that heavenly perspective when everything around us feels so intensely earthly, so polarized. I mean, the sermon speaker didn't sugarcoat it. They talked about how politics can really distort our vision,
Right.
make us lose sight of who the real enemy is.
It's like we get sucked into this vortex of political drama, and we forget that there's a much bigger spiritual battle going on.
Yeah.
And as the speaker pointed out, this distortion can lead us to ask the wrong questions. Instead of asking, how can I reflect God's love in this situation?
Right.
We find ourselves asking, how can I win this argument? Or how can I prove the other side wrong? It's so easy to get swept up in that kind of thinking, especially when social media just amplifies the outrage and the division.
Oh, totally.
You know, one thing that the speaker said that really stuck with me was how politics can divide families, friendships, even churches.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it, to see relationships fractured over political differences?
Yeah.
It's like we forget that we're all part of the same body, the body of Christ. And as Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it.
So true. But the speaker didn't leave us hanging, in despair.
Right.
They offered this powerful image of being healers, not dividers.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a call to action, an invitation to be peacemakers in a world that's so full of conflict.
Yes, and it requires a conscious choice to step back from the political fray and ask ourselves, how can I be a bridge builder in this situation?
Right.
How can I demonstrate God's love and grace even to those I disagree with?
Yeah, it's not about ignoring injustice or pretending that differences don't exist. It's about choosing a different posture, a different way of engaging.
It's about recognizing that our political opponents are not our enemies. They're our neighbors. They're image bearers of God just like us.
Yeah.
And as followers of Christ, we're called to love them, to pray for them, and to seek their good, even when it's hard.
So we've been given a lot to consider today. This sermon wrestled with some tough questions, and it didn't offer easy answers, but it did offer a framework for how to live out our faith in a complex world.
A world where leaders are flawed, where outcomes disappoint us, and where it's easy to let our political stances become our defining characteristic.
But as this sermon reminds us, our true identity is found in Christ, not in any political party or ideology.
And when we live out of that identity, it changes everything. It changes how we see the world, how we treat others, and how we engage in the public square.
So as you continue to process these ideas, here's a final thought for you to ponder. In this hyper-partisan age, what would it look like to be known more for your love than for your political stance? How can you be a healer, not a divider, in your own sphere of influence?
Those are questions